Hello, and welcome to the March 2026 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. Our guest this evening is humorist and writer Mike Sachs. Mike, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Oh, I'll do anything connected to freelancers, and you throw in the North Carolina connection. I love
Appreciate that. Tell us real quick. You mentioned
it.
earlier that you do have a North Carolina connection. You used to come here as a kid, right?
Yeah, I used to come here, go there all the time. I used to go to Avon on the coast, and also to Camp Seagull, which is on the Neuse River near Arapahoe towards Moorhead and New Bern, and just love it. And I have a lot of friends from Carolina. I went to school at Tulane in New Orleans, and have a ton of friends down there. It's a fantastic state. I love it.
And a deep literary history also.
Yes,
Before
that's
we move
right.
on to our questions, let me quickly read your biography so people have an understanding of where you're coming from. Um, Mike Sachs works on the editorial staff of Vanity Fair and has contributed to The New Yorker, Esquire, GQ, Believer, Vice, Salon, McSweeney's, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and other publications. He is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 comedy books and three audio projects, which have featured, among others, John Hamm, John Waters, Andy Richter, Paul F. Tompkins, Bob Odenkirk, Rhea Seehorn, Bobby Monahan, and Lorraine Newman. The last four books have been featured on Vulture's Best Comedy Books of the Year list, and he's a frequent opener for David Sedaris. That is a heck of a resume, Mike. It really
You
is.
just made me sound more successful than I am. And actually, speaking of Raleigh, David and Amy, I'm friends with Amy Sedaris too. They're from Raleigh.
Yep. Oh yeah, they're big names here locally. They really are.
Yeah,
Before
yeah,
we get into your career, this is a question that we start with for almost all of our guests. And I want to ask, you're a writer now, but were you
yeah,
a reader as a child? You know,
yeah.
are there authors or books in your youth that kind of inspired you and maybe pushed you towards a career in writing?
Yeah, I was a reader from the get-go, and I was a reader years before I wrote. And the authors I liked were one of two things. One was the Alfred Hitchcock Presents authors who wrote either horror or mystery, things that t took place next door, things you see on the Twilight Zone or Alfred Hitchcock Presents. The great writers who actually made a career out of writing short stories for magazines like Robert Bloch, Richard Matheson, and then later Stephen King, Peter Straub. So it was on that side I absolutely loved. And then also the other side was comedy. And it would be Gene Shepard, I was a huge fan of. Later, Woody Allen, his written books, and then David Sedaris. Also, John Waters was a huge influence on me. He grew up 45 miles north of where I grew up in Northern Virginia, Maryland. And I stumbled upon his work from a bootleg videos at the local video store, and I couldn't believe that anyone would. It was like something that was broadcast from another planet. I just couldn't believe that someone so close was doing something like this and getting away with it. And his impishness and his sensibility was really a big factor in what I later became. Also, David Letterman and Chris Elliott, when Chris Elliott was on David Letterman, that was huge. And I'm lucky enough to know Chris. And the next project I'm working on, I actually wrote for him. And I don't think people have really written for him very accurately. I think what he did on Letterman on Late Night was very specific. The characters he did, it was very almost as disturbing as it was funny. He later became more goofy, but I like the scary aspect of Chris Elliott. And that's what I tried to aim for in this new script. So it's the combination of horror and comedy, which really made the biggest effect on me.
Interesting. Well, you know, Mike, tell us about your creative path, your journey to becoming a professional writer. What were your earliest efforts, and what did you learn from those experiences?
Well, I was a terrible student. I was tutored in English for years. I just wasn't interested in diagramming. Everything they taught, I just wasn't interested. The books that they would give, Billy Budd, I wasn't interested in. But I read all the time on my own. Um, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was an English major in college, but I really didn't take any writing classes, but would write for fun. I would pitch various magazines like Crack Magazine, and you mentioned Mad before. That was one of my first professional success stories. Is I submitted something and they accepted it, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had I didn't know any writers. I didn't know anyone who knew any writers. The professors I had were down in New Orleans. They weren't making a living at writing beyond academic type books. So I just sort of struggled. And I worked retail for many years, 10 years, from 15 to 25 in a record store. And I knew I wanted to write comedy, but I didn't know how to write for TV or the movies. I just didn't have any connections. So what I did was I wrote for the written page. I just had a computer or a typewriter, and that's what I could afford to do, and that's what I did. And the purpose was to later become sort of, I always looked at it as being like a minor league baseball player who's discovered and called up to the majors. I thought someone would call me up to write for Letterman or SNL or one of these shows. But by writing for the page for so long, I liked it a lot and I became proficient at it. And it's really what I ended up preferring. I like writing humor for the written page, now also for audio projects, but it's what I enjoy doing. And it's a very specific craft that I could not have learned if someone had tried to teach me. I took sitting down and doing it and learning what to do, and more importantly, learning what not to do. And the process just became quicker over the years. I can recognize if an idea isn't going anywhere. I can recognize if something is going down the wrong path. It used to take me months. I can do that now within an afternoon, come back to it after lunch and see, oh, this is not working. So that is what I tell young students is in the end, you have to teach yourself. No one can really teach you because it's a very personal thing. And you just have to sit down and do it like you would to become a better stand-up comedian. You just have to go up there and do it. To become a playwright, you have to write plays. To write for the written page is very specific. And a lot of people who are very talented who can write other things like movies, TV, and stand-up cannot transfer over to it because it's that specific. But you do have to teach yourself how to do it. And it can take a while. And you need to be patient with yourself and not be too difficult on yourself. I was very, very hard on myself when I first started. And I just wish I could go back and just ease up a bit because the pressure I put on myself was just too much at the beginning.
What do you enjoy the most about writing, Mike? And even today, what do you find challenging?
Well, I have to write. If I don't write, I'm depressed and anxious and have OCD. And I mean depressed. I mean like horribly depressed. So I'm not fun to be around if I'm not writing, but it does produce work. And because I'm anxious and have OCD, I have to write every day. And I've told this to other people who have OCD. OCD is a form of energy. And instead of using it to say turn on a light 50 times a day or to not do this or not do that, if you can funnel that energy into something creative, then you will produce a lot because the energy is very strong. Now, what's interesting is I put out 2 books of interviews with comedy writers, and I would say 75% of the writers I've interviewed suffer from OCD. Now, it's depression in comedy has been written about, but OCD in comedy has never been written about. And I actually reached out to Dr. Oliver Sacks, no relation, to see if there was a connection. He didn't know of any. And I still don't, I mean, it's not scientifically proven, but so many of the people that I interviewed who are comedy writers, including David Sedaris, and that's really why I first started asking, because he's written about it and I knew he'd be willing to talk about it. And I told him that I suffer from it. And there's a really strong connection. I'm not sure what it is, whether it rewires your brain or it is functional for you and advantageous for you as a writer to have it in that you have to write every day. I'm not sure what it is, but there's a very strong connection between OCD and comedy writing. And it's fascinating to me. Now, I didn't know what I had as a kid, and it scared me terribly when I was a kid. But it later proved to be, and that's the great thing about writing, is that things that are looked at as being disadvantages when you're a kid, whether it's being a daydreamer or not doing great in math, or rather, wanting to read comic books in the back of the class, all that comes into play when you become a writer. And you use all of that later when you become professional. As far as the disadvantages of writing, the things I don't like, um, I think it's important to know I got into writing to write a certain thing, and I was hard on myself for writing other things just to make money that I did enjoy writing, and I felt guilty for that. When you deal with a business, sometimes you have to write things you don't want to write. But I think it's important to have a two-track system where you're making a living at something that frees you up to be able to write on the side, write what you want, how you want. And I've sort of I'm now more comfortable and can do that. So what I disliked most about writing was, say, writing something that was not something that I was good at writing or that interested me. And I don't think any professional writer should do that. I think it's exhausting, and no one gets into writing to write things they don't want to write. They get into it because they had so much fun as a kid. So I think it's really important. You do have to make a living, but I think it's important just for your soul to keep producing and writing things that make you happy. And I lost track of that for a number of years.
I'm kind of in that spot right now myself professionally, in that Social Security has given me a bit of a buffer so that I don't have to write for the dollar as much as I used to, and instead can turn my attention to some lesser paying assignments, but which will be tremendous fun for me. And that's a really wonderful place to be. It is, to have that kind of a freedom. Mike,
Well,
we
I
talked.
should say too, no, I think that's extremely important. And I think it's important for people starting out, because I wrote for free a lot when I was just starting, and it was those free pieces that people noticed because I wasn't under pressure,
Mhm.
and it wasn't done for money. It was done for pure joy, and that's when my writing style came out. And I think even if you are a professional writer, I think it's important to take on these various tasks that sometimes may not pay that much or at all if it's going to be read. I think it's advantageous for you, just career wise, to get out your purest form of writing that means the most to you and represents you as a writer most accurately.
Mike, we mentioned in your introduction a number of the top tier publications in which you've been published over the years. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you broke into those markets. GQ, Esquire, McSweeney's, big names in publishing. What was your entrance to those particular markets? How did you kind of get through the gatekeepers?
Well, I think the most important thing is to know people. And by moving to New York City and working at Vanity Fair, you end up knowing people. When I first started out, I looked at writing as a competition, me versus the world. In the end, it's the opposite of that. It's really the people who you know and who like you and who you like are the ones that are going to get you published. And just by being in the scene. Now, I don't think you have to be in New York or LA to do that anymore. I think it's advantageous. I think anyone, anywhere in Carolina or wherever, can create these relationships with people. But I think it's important to go after exactly what you want. Some people take years to admit to themselves, this is what I want to do. I think it's really important to say, this is what I want to do. This is exactly what I want to do. And a good way to get in, I found, and I recommend this for younger writers, is to play to people's ego. So if there's a magazine that you like, and there's an editor, I wouldn't go too high. I'd go right in the middle, maybe a senior editor rather than an editor in chief. Reach out to them, say, listen, I'm a fan of your work. Can I interview you? Rather than say, hey, can you get me in the magazine or can you give me career advice? When you play to that ego, whether it's for your own podcast or website or whatever it is, people typically say yes. And by getting into the world that way, it's a good way to then keep in touch and maybe reach out to them down the road. So they'll know who you are. It's also important to be very easy to work with. There's a lot of talent out there, but a lot of writers can be difficult. I think most editors want to work with someone who is capable and easy to work with. It's really important to be nice
Mhm.
and not to know how to pitch and not be obnoxious about it, and know how to take rejection as well.
Mhm.
I know so many editors who will give a rejection and then the writer will lash back at them. And that is something I can guarantee you will not get you into that magazine publication down the road. So it's really, really important to be a nice guy, be a mensch rather than a jerk, because there's a lot of jerks out there. So it's a combination of networking and being nice. And also, of course, the third issue is just producing quality and making sure that when you are ready to submit, it's clean and it's ready to go. You know, because likes, no one being editors likes to receive sloppy work, especially from professional writers. And everyone is capable of being edited. So if you have anyone you respect, another writer, a relative, your wife, your husband, whomever, I suggest getting a fresh pair of eyes on it before you send it out to any of these, especially these major publications. And actually, the last piece of advice I would give is now with GQ or any of these bigger, even New Yorker, it's easier to get in on the web than it is in the print magazine. And quite frankly, I think maybe more people read the web anyway. Typically, the web is edited by younger editors, so it's easier to reach them, editors who are looking for writers to write for them. So I would recommend starting off on the web, say, for if you want to get into GQ, and then from there, if you still want to get into the magazine itself, start pitching to another editor or to the same editor and just say that I want to get into the print. But your chances of getting in are better on the web than it is in print.
I'm really glad you mentioned all of that, Mike, and all of that is really solid advice, but especially your advice about being a nice person. That's a characteristic that I actively cultivate, and I think it has helped me tremendously professionally over the years. It really has. Like you said, don't be a jerk, and editors would prefer to work with a nice person. I think another point, though, that you didn't make, but I think is important, is the issue of patience. I think a lot of writers today are very impatient. They want a response immediately, and they get very upset when they don't get one. And then they lash out, like you mentioned, some others do, and that can be problematic. But
Well, I
editors
mean,
are
listen,
busy.
I
They can't
understand.
get back to you in 15 minutes usually. It might be a few
No,
days or even longer than that.
right. But I understand the frustration. If you're a writer making a living and you don't hear back from someone after a few weeks, it's very frustrating.
Oh,
There is a
absolutely.
certain there is a certain point where you do have to nicely get back to them. And another piece of advice I would give is there's not one person who represents the entire publication on any publication. So if an editor isn't getting back to you, say at GQ or New Yorker, there are other editors you can pitch. And it's not like you can't get in touch with them just because you haven't heard back from the first editor.
Excellent. Terrific. Let's talk next about Here's the Kicker and Poking a Dead Frog, which are, as you noted, are collection is a both of them are collections of interviews with comedy writers. But before I get deeper into this, what was the inspiration for this project? How did this come about, these two books?
Well, really, it came about because I was fascinated by comedy writing. I would always look at the writers at the end of a TV show at the scroll. I'm like, how do you do that? How does one become a comedy writer? There were really no books about it. The typical book was written by someone who didn't make a career at writing, certainly at the top level, unless it was like a memoir by Sid Caesar or someone. But for writers themselves, there's very, very few books except for, say, SNL histories or your show of show histories from the 50s and 60s. But I wanted more modern writers, those I grew up watching, shows that I liked, Simpsons and others. And there was just nothing out there. And this is pre-podcast, pre-website concentrating on comedy writing interviews. Now there's a ton of them, but at this time in 2008, there was really very little out there. So I just wanted a book that I would have wanted to have read in high school myself. If you're a new writer or just wanting to know more about this very, very mysterious business, how does one go from point A to point B? How does one become a professional writer of jokes, whether for the page or for movies or TV. And because it was sort of a new idea, it took forever to get. It was rejected 30 times and was only accepted because I had a friend who worked at Writer's Digest Publishing in Ohio, and he pushed it through with them. And that's how the first book, And Here's the Kicker, came about. Um, but what I found was that a lot of these comedy writers from the 50s, even going back further, I mean, I interviewed comedy writers for the Marx Brothers.
Mhm.
I interviewed a 96-year-old writer, Peg Lynch, who created a modern sitcom. It was really interesting because it was very hard to pitch, but once I had the go ahead, it was very easy to get a lot of writers because they were, in many ways, just waiting for someone to ask about their careers. Even people who had won many awards, like Larry Gelbart, who wrote for Bob Hope, Sid Caesar, created the TV show MASH, co-wrote Tootsie. People weren't interested in asking him. Younger comedy writers weren't interested in asking him about how he made it, what his advice would be. And I found that crazy. I mean, it's almost like still living with Babe Ruth and you're a baseball player and you don't reach out and say, hey, what worked for you? How did you do it? The information's out there. You just have to reach out. So when I reached out, especially to the older writers, they were very happy to talk to me. Each of these interviews were many, many hours. They're Playboy length, Paris Review length, takes a tremendous amount of material. This is not a quick interview for the web. So it sometimes be, 10, 15, 20 hours over a period of months talking to them, and they were all willing to do so. The older writers got back to me immediately. I noticed a lot of the hip younger writers never got back to me at all. But which I didn't mind that in the end because a lot of these writers that I was lucky enough to interview ended up passing away not long after the book came out. So to be able to talk to Irv Brecker, who wrote for Groucho Marx and was in the room when Somewhere Over the Rainbow was being written, he was on set. I mean, that to me is just a bridge to another time that will not will not exist anymore. It's over. So it was really those writers that I was most thankful to have contacted.
Would
Now,
you
of
explain?
course, if
I'm
I
sorry.
were no, if I
No,
were
go
to
ahead.
write a book like this, I think it would be more difficult because the competition for comedy writers be interviewed is a lot higher. There's a lot of people out there doing this, but when I first started, it seemed to be sort of a fallow area that was actually beneficial to me um, by being able to get these people to talk to me.
Would you explain both titles, especially Poking a Dead Frog?
Yeah. And here's the kicker. Both of these books, I really struggled with the titles. And here's the kicker. It was just like it was an old comedy term. And here's the kicker, and then the punchline. With Poking a Dead Frog, E.B. White is a famous quote by E.B. White, who wrote for New Yorker, wrote Charlotte's Web, wrote a ton of great books. And he said, analyzing comedy is like analyzing a frog. It's not going to be fun, and the frog will die of it. So that to me was sort of poking fun at myself. Like here I am, I'm poking a dead frog by looking into something that a lot of people think would not be as fun as the comedy itself. So that's where those two titles came from.
I loved the eclectic nature of the writers that you brought together. SNL, The Simpsons, The Onion, late night talk shows. It is really, really broad. Why was it important to you to cast such a wide net for a book like this?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's really important for all writers, especially young writers, to know, and I wish I knew it sooner, that one medium, one genre is no more or less important than the next. And I think if you want to write humor, you can write it for the page. You can write it as a comic. You can write it as a comic strip. You can write it as a New Yorker short story. You can write it as a Playboy type story. You can write it as a McSweeney's, an Onion type story. You can write for the stage, stand up, one person show. You can write a movie, a TV. There's a million things you can do. And whatever interests you, whatever you think the best vehicle is for your comedy, I think is no less or more important than any of the others. So I wanted to show that as a comedy writer, you don't have to be just a pure joke writer. You can write a book that's funny, and that's I interviewed George Saunders, or you can write a weekly newspaper humor column, and I interviewed various newspaper columnists. And it just fascinates me that they all got into it and found their niche. And I wish I knew that when I was first starting off, because I always thought one has to write this type of comedy, whether it's a New Yorker type short humor piece or writing for David Letterman. But you can write whatever you want. And I want to encourage kids to be able to go out and get their comedy across in any way that they're most comfortable in doing. I think any medium is as effective in producing comedy, whether it's graphic novels or YouTube videos. There's a lot. I don't want people to feel limited. And I sort of felt limited, like I have to write for a New Yorker. I didn't even read New Yorker until I was out of college. And I wish someone had said to me, you can write whatever you want to write, however you want, as long as you make it work. And what I wanted to show was these people made it work. And what do they have to do to make it work, both creatively and financially? And what do they suggest you do? And what do they suggest you not do, which is even more important? What do you avoid uh, getting into the business? And that was really my goal.
You mentioned Peg Lynch, literally invented the sitcom, as you mentioned, with Ethel and Albert in the 40s and 50s, and Irving Brecker, who wrote two screenplays for the Marx Brothers early on. And I have to say, I thought the Brecker interview was among the most fun for me. I really enjoyed that historical context and the stories he told, the Milton Berle story he told.
Yeah.
Why you these a whole different older generation of comedy writers. What did they bring to the party, Mike? Why did you want
Oh,
to
I mean,
include those kinds of voices?
well, they fascinated me because these are people who didn't study comedy in college. They didn't take writing courses. These are people who literally grew up on the streets and supported their family by writing jokes and by writing at all. Many of them were also World War II vets, and that changed who they were tremendously. With a lot of the early comedy writers, their comedy came from human experience and a lived life rather than, say, maybe a younger comedy writer who learned about comedy through watching every Simpsons episode. And to me, the comedy that comes from real life and from knowing as many people as possible and experiencing as many things as possible, even sometimes horrific, like what they saw in World War II, that fascinated me. And, you know, I really think it's important for any career, for anyone getting into any career, to look back and see who came before you and to not know about people who wrote for Laurel and Hardy or the Marx Brothers or any of that. I think is you're missing a tremendous opportunity. Um, and they were filled with wisdom and stories. Peg Lynch told a story about how her mother was a nurse at the Mayo Clinic and she was a teenager and she had the gumption to start a local radio show. And one of the first guests she got was patients would come through the Mayo Clinic, famous patients, because of, that was the go-to place at the time for health issues. And her mom worked there. So her mom set up an interview between this teenage girl and Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig was there being diagnosed with ALS. And even though he was being diagnosed with ALS, he took the time to talk to this 14-year-old kid for the radio program. Unfortunately, the radio program no longer exists, is lost to whatever. But just the fact that this woman who was sitting at home and hadn't been interviewed in years, I just sort of stumbled upon her by accident. It's just an amazing gift to be able to have that and to be able to talk to someone from a different generation. I think not to do that is a real mistake for anyone. Everyone wants to be new and fresh, but a lot of the things that you consider new and fresh have been done many years ago. And the more you know, the more you'll know what to avoid and what to concentrate on. And those older writers for me were the most amazing. And I just feel truly lucky that I got to talk with them before they passed away. Even some younger writers passed away, like Harold Ramis I interviewed, who Stripes, Caddyshack, co-wrote Animal House. And he passed away not long after I interviewed him, and he's gone forever now. So it's important to reach out to those who are may not be here with us that much longer, and to pick their brains and find out what worked for them.
These are important interviews that you conducted as far as cultural history goes. The book is about comedy writing, but all of the tips and the advice and the do this, don't do that, when you boil it down, it really seemed to come down to writing. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Regardless of genre, whatever you write, the advice that these individuals were offering play to a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
And the point that I got most commonly was you need to put your butt in a chair and put words on paper. It's literally as
Yep.
simple as that. Do you agree, Mike?
Yeah. I mean, there were various things that came up across all mediums that were sort of overlapped. And one of the main ones is you really have to work very hard, no matter the stage. Mel Brooks works very hard. David Sedaris works his ass off, I can assure you. All these people work really hard. So when you go into writing in a creative endeavor, know that you're going to be working really, really hard. Also know that there are going to be ups and there are going to be downs. And it's not going to be a job, say, working as an accountant. There's nothing wrong with that. But, each day may be the same as an accountant. We're writing, there's going to be peaks and valleys. And you really have to just work at it. A lot of these people that I interviewed work every day, including Christmas, holidays, weekends. They just never stop. And I think that's one of the things you have to do. But the overlying message too was you can't get into it for the money, and you can't write what you think others are going to want. You really have to write what you like and what comes out of you most naturally. Someone like David Sedaris didn't get into the style because he thought it would sell the most books. This is truly who he is. And I think it's very, very important not to get into it for the money, not to get into it to get rich, but also to be true to yourself and stick with your style and sensibility, even though it may take you a few years to achieve success. It's very, very important because a reader can tell if an author is bullshitting. And someone like Stephen King, who's not comedy, although he has comedy, is just he writes about that's who he is. And readers like that, and they want to know him, and they want to read his stories. And I think the same goes for David Sedaris. So authenticity is extremely important.
I think one of some of the best writing advice in the book in I think it was Poking a Dead Frog, came from Amy Poehler of Saturday Night Live. And she said, read your stuff out aloud. Sometimes the way it reads in your head sounds different when someone says it. And it's not easy. Good people make it look easy, and a lot of people want to do it because they think it looks easy. She's talking about comedy writing, but I think that this applies to all different kinds of writing, that basic
Completely.
advice right there.
No, it's extremely difficult. And if someone makes, I don't care what it is, whether if you're a plumber or a surgeon or what have you, they're going to make it look easy. My father was a dentist, and I used to work at his office over summers in Virginia, and next door was an oral surgeon. And I invited myself over. I said, "Can I see you do a tooth extraction?" And the person sat down and was given nitrous oxide or whatever it was, and in 2 minutes the tooth was out. And I said to the surgeon, "Wow, that was easy." He goes, "Yeah, that's 40 years of experience and 20 years of schooling easy." So it was really an important lesson because it looked easy to me. But everything is difficult. I don't care what it is. To make it look easy is a real talent. Now, what's interesting about that Amy Poehler advice was that that's advice that she came to by herself. She wasn't taught that by comedy teachers to read something out loud. That was something she came to. And over the years, you'll come to do things that'll make it easier for you. For instance, pieces that I write look different in different contexts. So if I'm writing a piece in Word, sometimes I'll email it to myself. It looks different and it reads different. Or I'll write a piece and then put it into the margins that it'll appear in, say, the New Yorker, and it'll look like a New Yorker piece, and it just reads differently. So you come across these tricks that only you can teach yourself because it's a very personal thing, writing, and that'll help you. But it takes a while to get to that. And that's why you really have to be patient with yourself, because this is not a trick that you're going to come up with immediately. It'll take some time.
Mike, did writing both books influence you at all personally? You know, what did you come away from the experience with?
Well, in one of the most maybe selfish ways, it helped me professionally because I came to become friendly with a lot of these people, Bob Odenkirk, David Sedaris, and then even people who read the book who were comedy fans like John Hamm. Um, that all came about because I wrote the book, and I didn't write it for much money. I just did it because it interested me. But the advice that I got um, from these people who are very successful, maybe such as Mel Brooks, what he told me sort of, I just couldn't believe that this is someone who is in his 90s now and he's still working really, really hard, and he's still frustrated with the industry. And if someone like Mel Brooks is frustrated with the industry, then that means that you too can be frustrated with the industry. In a way, the best advice is everyone is miserable. And the sooner you realize that, the happier you're going to be, because there's no one on the easy street. Everyone, even a Mel Brooks, is struggling. And it's a great lesson, because if Mel Brooks is struggling, that means that it's built into the system and you too are going to struggle. And if you do struggle, don't take it to a level where you want to quit. Just keep going. All these people never quit. And that's really one of the bigger lessons too, is you just can't quit. You have to keep going. If this is a career for you, if it's not, that's fine too. But there's frustration at every level. I don't care how successful you are. And I think that
Did,
that's an important thing to know.
did writing the books open any doors for you or create any other writing opportunities for you?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You never know what's going to lead to what. So I became friendly with John Hamm after he liked one of the books. He was actually supposed to pose. For those who don't know, John Hamm is an actor who was in Mad Men, um, and he's in a bunch of movies and TV shows. A great guy and a huge fan of comedy. There he is. So
Is that
that
it? That's
photo,
you, right,
yeah,
Mike?
well, that's me. Yes, on an off day, looking very handsome. Um, he that was supposed to be for the cover, and it didn't work out. So he did my author's photo. But by doing that, he ended up becoming friends, and I've worked with him on comedy projects, a few comedy projects after that. And it was all because of those interviews. You don't know what is going to lead to what. It's really important to open yourself up to experiences and people, and just producing and getting something tangible out there. And good things tend to happen, rather than talking about wanting to do something or pitching something for 5 years. I think it's very important to do what you want to do, move down, get it out, move on down the path. And good things tend to happen when things are out in the world.
Were there any writers that you really wanted to talk to but simply weren't able to get?
Yeah, there was a few. Mike White is a comedy writer.
I'm not familiar with him.
He's done a tremendous amount of work. He wrote for Freaks and Geeks.
Okay.
Um, but he's most well known for The White Lotus. He writes all the episodes of The White Lotus. Brilliant guy, and he just never got back to me. Tina Fey never got back to me. There's quite a few people who never got back to me. What I've learned though over the years is that if someone doesn't get back to you, it may be a good thing, uh, because not everyone who is talented is good at talking about themselves. You need a certain type of ego to be able to do that. And there were also many people I interviewed who didn't make the final cut of the book. I just didn't feel that either I was on target or they were on target. And, I would say maybe 20% didn't make the book. but most of the people that I got, I was happy with, especially those who readers may not have been that familiar with. Those are the ones to me that were the most rewarding. The Peg Lynch, the Irv Breckers, rather than the super famous.
I think Marshall Brickman might fall into that category too, Mike. You interviewed Brickman, who had a remarkable career and collaborated with Woody Allen on several screenplays, including Annie Hall, Manhattan, and a couple of
Manhattan Murder Mystery.
that's right. But you did, and he was wonderful. I loved the interview was fascinating, but you didn't get Woody Allen. I was curious if this was an intentional thing. You know what I mean? If you had a collaborative relationship, you went with
Yeah.
one and not with the other. I was just
Well, that was a
curious
case.
how that was working.
I did try to get Woody Allen, but there's a case of someone not being a very, very good interview subject. And people in comedy really love the fact that I didn't get Woody Allen, that I got someone like Marshall Brickman, who was lesser known, who has a fascinating history, who started off as a musician. His banjo is on the dueling banjos of the Deliverance soundtrack. Fascinating history. Uh, in like even just talking to him, he told me a story about how he was invited to a party in the 60s and he couldn't go for whatever reason, and it turned out to be the night of the Manson murders at Sharon Tate's house. So just stories like that. When you interview someone who hasn't been interviewed as much, you tend to get stories that are interesting, more interesting to readers that have never heard it before. Someone like Woody Allen's been interviewed a million times. Someone like Paul McCartney's been interviewed a million times. So I felt my job was to reach out to those people who had great stories, who produced great work, who had a very successful career, who may not have been as much of a household word name as others like Marshall Brickman, but had a fascinating story to tell. So I'm actually glad I didn't get Woody Allen, that I got someone like Marshall Brickman for the book.
And similarly, you talked to Merrill Marco, who had a relationship with David Letterman and was a close collaborator with David Letterman. And so you got her, but you didn't get Dave. She talks about Dave, but Merrill is also a fascinating individual with her own unique story. Was Letterman a possible get for you, or you didn't even think about that? He
I
wasn't
didn't
even
even
on your list.
try. He's been interviewed a million times and he'll tell you the same stories. But being a super fan of that show, I knew about Meryl, and she was really the tone and sensibility of Late Night with David Letterman. That was all her. She used to write Letterman stand-up routines when he was on Carson. She never really got the credit for it. Tremendous career. She wrote for The Page essays, tremendously influential. And that's another case of wanting to interview someone who was behind the scenes. Now, the whole purpose of the book was not to interview famous people. It was to interview writers, comedy writers. And she's a pure comedy writer who had a tremendous influence on an entire generation of comedy writers with Late Night with David Letterman. And I didn't think she had gotten the credit she deserved. And that's another case where I was lucky enough to be friends with her because of that interview, which I'm very happy about because she's just the nicest, most talented person. I could, I guess, have reached out to Letterman, but I always looked at this as being a book about craft for writers and not necessarily for comedy fans, those really who want to get into comedy writing. How does one do it? And Merrill in a specific case was how does this kid from the Midwest go from, being in art school to then creating one of the most influential TV shows, late night TV shows ever. That's what interested me.
These two books are all about advice for comedy, from comedy writers, for potential comedy writers. So, Mike, let me wind down our conversation by asking you, as a freelance writer, and you've offered a little bit of advice this evening, but what other advice might you offer, especially beginning freelance writers, not necessarily comedy writers, but just writers in general? From your own experience, what have you learned that you would like to share with others?
Well, one thing I think is really important, and I've had to teach myself this, is I don't think you need an agent anymore to produce books. I think it's really quite easy to put out your own book. And if you're out there pitching the same book idea for 5, 6 years, just circling the drain, I think it's much more beneficial to you as a writer to just put it out yourself, to get an editor, a good editor, get a great designer, a great book designer, and to put out the book. You can do it through Amazon or Ingram Press or wherever. And it's much easier at that point to then sell your next book, because to sell an agent on an idea is much more difficult than just saying, I wrote this. These are the blurbs. People seem to like it. This is my next idea. Would you be okay uh, with taking a look at it? I think some people can spin around for years on the same idea, and before they know it, a decade has passed. I think it's very important to not become too wedded to any idea, to keep moving, to pitch as many different type of places as possible. Sometimes even a different editor at the same organization. Sometimes you have to be a little bit forward, not obnoxious, but if you really want to get into a magazine and someone doesn't get back to you, go to another editor. Keep going. You can't really get down on yourself. You just have to be kind of stubborn and keep going. And take on projects that you may not be paid greatly for, but you have a lot of fun doing. You need that, especially if you're taking projects on just for the money. It's just beneficial to who you are as a writer, to be able to do that, and also boost your ego. But I think lastly, the most important thing is to reach out to people and don't look at it as a competition. Look at it like what your group is doing. You're coming up together, you're helping each other. That's really how it works. And it's almost like coming up through the military. You have to work together. The people who will hire you down the road are people that you'll know, especially if you're young, just starting out. And just be a mensch, be nice. Don't look at it as competitive. If someone sends you a piece and you're jealous because it's so beautifully written, don't be a jerk. Be honest and say, I love this and I hope it gets published. It's not one or another. Just because someone gets published doesn't mean that you won't. So it's really all boats rising type of thing. And just meet as many people as possible, ask to interview them, and keep a document of everyone that you interview and how you know them. And just keep going and don't stop. That's the only thing. It's a very specific occupation, but boy, I tell you, to be able to do this compared with a lot of the jobs I worked growing up, I feel very lucky. I could still be in retail. I could still be working as a temp. So there'll be down times, but also know that at the very least, it's more interesting than doing most other type of jobs.
That is awesome advice, Mike. Before we go to audience questions, tell us a little bit briefly about Stanland.
Well, all right, this is an example of an idea I had for maybe 25 years that I couldn't find an appropriate medium for. The idea is that this idiot from Maryland, much like myself, discovers a fantasy land like Narnia, called Zingia, and then messes it up through capitalism. He turns it into Myrtle Beach, basically. Um, Now, different ideas have different, places for them. And this was an idea that really didn't work for the page. It would have worked, I thought, for animation, but I didn't know anyone in animation. But it just so happens that I got into this audio world where I could write these 1940s type of comedies, that they're 5 episodes, maybe 3.5 hour long total. They're standalone, and you can produce different worlds within them. So it was just a matter of hanging on to this idea until I had the opportunity to be able to do this and hire actors to bring forth this world. And I
You've
thought
got
it turned
some
out,
fun names working with you on this. I think Bobby Moynihan, I think, is involved. Is
yeah,
that right?
yeah, yeah. Ray Seahorn from Better Call Saul, and then Pluribus. She's just in Pluribus. Uh, John Waters did it. John Hamm did it. Um, it was just a fun thing to be able to write and then to be able to produce. But I'll tell you, it goes back to knowing old radio comedy scripts, like from Bob and Ray, or all that early type of comedy, which I was familiar with, that I brought to the table, that I could produce something modern. And it's an outlet now that doesn't cost that much money, And rather than pitching a TV or movies for years, I can just put it out and move on to the next idea, which is what I did for the new Chris Elliott project. It's important sometimes just to forge your own path. And this was something that really wasn't being done. And I kind of wondered why. And it's, I think, now being done more often. It's cheap, you could do it quickly, much like the 1940s radio comedies. And it's just a nice way to get it out there rather than pitching Hollywood for 4 years and not ever hearing back.
I look forward to checking it out. It sounds like a really, really interesting thing.
It's
Really,
different.
excuse me. Mike, I could talk to you for another 2 hours. Just having a great time. I love talking about comedy. Let's open it up to some audience questions here. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Mike? Anything that you've talked about? Anybody? Mike, I guess you out. Toby, did you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask your advice on humor writing. My I've tried writing for about 3 years. I took a class with Jeff Bender called Writing for McSweeney's, and I said I wanted my money back because I've been trying for 3 years to get in McSweeney's, and finally just got a really nice rejection this year from Chris Monks. But I just wondered what your advice would be for doing that because I read all your pieces, and when I have friends that don't appreciate humor, I use whoops as my kind of like bridge to get them to appreciate,
Yeah,
that type of humor. So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and I see so many of your pieces on McSweeney's, but is it more the
yeah.
topic? Because I have written things about, weird stuff like flies and dung beetles, and maybe I just need to do more because I see yours are like advice for the woman dating me when you have sex with me, or, workplace
Yeah.
things, school things. Maybe I'm just picking the wrong topics.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, who is Jeff Bender and why was he teaching this course? Has he been in McSweeney's?
I think he has, yeah. Yeah, I know he has. And he works for Hugo House and teaches a class, and that's what he named the class.
Right. I don't know Jeff Bender, but I will say this just from my own experience is sometimes these courses are taught by people who can't make a living at what they're teaching. And you do have to be a little bit careful about spending money on some of that stuff. But I think as far as McSweeney's, it's about reading as many of the pieces as possible, knowing that a lot of times the ideas in the title, knowing that it's a very dry sense of humor, knowing it's combining, say, this with that, the style of Edgar Allan Poe with something modern. But I think what's important is just write what you want to write and make yourself laugh. These pieces don't pay much, so you're obviously not doing it for the money. But I think, and I know a lot of people who've pitched to them for years. And Chris he's the editor of McSweeney's, a terrific guy, really
Mhm.
sweet, really good guy, and he's very patient. And you just got to keep on doing it. Don't write something you think they're gonna like, but write something that just genuinely makes you laugh. I think it's inevitable that you'll get in there, and it's a great feeling when you do. Boy, when you can send out to your friends that you've been in McSweeney's and post on Facebook the link to it, that's why you're doing this, right? So it'll happen eventually.
Mike,
Okay.
what was the topic
A
of your
question?
very first sale to McSweeney's? Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. It was in 1999 and just got out of college. And it was fake movie bloopers. So it was all about very specific scenes and then a character's wearing this from one scene, but not to the next. But the whole joke was not about that blooper as much as just the fact that the specific actor, I forget who it was not good in the film. I mean, that was the gag. So it was a very long, specific setup, and then, but like Eddie Murphy is not good in this, or whatever it was. At that time, Dave Eggers was doing the accepting. This was how long ago it was. It's 26 years ago now, 27 years ago. But I think part of the thing too is that I got into it early, and I got into it early because I was told about it from going out to lunch with a writer, great writer, Jabari Asim, who worked at the Washington Post where I worked, and he told me about it. A lot of these things that come up that you hear about, you wouldn't have heard about otherwise if you didn't go out and get lunch with this person. So that's why it's important too to keep, in touch with people whose opinion you respect and whose sensibility you respect, because it shouldn't just be you out there discovering all these things. Use your friends to learn about a really good story online, or a really good book, or a really good audio project. It just makes it easier. And I like asking people, like, what are you listening to? What are you reading? Things I never even would have heard of. I think that's very important. And also to look where others aren't. Instead of reading the same author that everyone reads, instead of watching the same reality shows, go to a used bookstore, or go through old newspapers, go through different, I once got an idea for a New Yorker piece. I was just reading about from airplane World War II. And I use that in a modern setting where a modern guy in Maryland gets into an airplane and drops propaganda leaflets over his old girlfriend's house to try to convince her to get back with him. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't just stumble upon this while doing research. So I think it's really important to look where others are not looking.
I have a
Awesome.
question.
Yes, Joel?
Yeah, now you mentioned the writing for audio for I guess you might call it podcasts. Are you able, or are you doing, using that as an opening to other media? I know
Yes.
David Sedaris was originally discovered because a producer got snowed in Chicago and
That's
go to
right.
reading.
Yeah.
I might add, by the way, that his sister Gretchen was my gallery dealer for years, and she's
Huh.
pretty funny lady
Yeah.
herself, and so is his
Yeah.
brother. Um, but it would seem to me that you can leverage some of
Yes.
this to show people. It's like a demo
Mhm.
reel, I suppose, in a sense.
That's an excellent point. And that's exactly what I recommend to people. This is an idea, Stanland, that I had pitched to various people. And because you get an idea doesn't mean that they get it, that they understand it. So by producing something tangible, in this case, a 5-part audio series about this fantasy land that turns to crap, that does open up other avenues. It's now being pitched for TV, which it never would have otherwise, especially when it's
Mhm.
out there and people talk about it and it wins awards and people are associated with it, like John Hamm or John Waters. It makes the credentials of it more solid. And I think that's a very important thing, that if you do have an idea that, say, you think is only perfect for the movies or only perfect for this, just put it out under your own hand in whatever medium. And if someone likes it, good things tend to happen from it. I put out a self-published book a number of years ago. It was a novelization to a non-existent CB and trucking movie called Stinker Lets Loose. And by doing that, as the book was out there, it someone asked if they could turn it into an audio project, and then it was turned into an audio project with a lot of famous people. And that never would have happened if I had pitched it. So it's really important to be very stubborn sometimes and say, you know what, you don't get the idea, that's fine, but I'll show you what I'm thinking, and this is it. And just because it's in this medium doesn't mean that it can't now go to another medium and become even more successful.
I have a a non-follow-up question. Have you
Yeah,
got kids?
one child, daughter.
Okay. The reason I ask is my father was a professional novelist, and I remember English teachers would sort of look at me like, "Oh, your father's a writer. That must be so exciting."
Yeah.
And as a kid, all I thought was, "No, he's a flat, bald guy who sits in the guest room all day in front of a typewriter." I mean, I
Right,
could
that's
watch
right.
paint dry.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, my daughter does not, I've asked her if she's talked about me being a writer. She couldn't care less. What's interesting too is she's Gen Z, I'm Gen X. The humor does not translate, I can assure you. So
Hmm.
she's not impressed at all. But that's her role as a daughter, is not to be impressed. I wasn't
Right.
impressed that my dad could do dental surgery. I look back now and think, Jesus, I should have watched him a little more closely. But as a 16-year-old daughter, that's her role is to be a little not negative, but everything dad does isn't fantastic, I can assure you. But it's a good thing because That's how you're treated in the real world, and that's the way I'd
Yeah.
rather be treated, just like any
I'm
other
sure
schmuck out
you can
there.
write humor about having a 16-year-old daughter.
I just did for New Yorker, as a matter of fact.
Does anyone else have any questions for Mike? All right, oh, Hannah.
Mostly what really resonated with me for this was talking about, not worrying about making money and all these external things. And for a while ago, I worked with a writing coach, and in order to take me on, she wanted to know why I was writing. And I remember feeling really embarrassed because I was like, I want to write something that I would want to read. That was my big motivation, something interesting that I would want to read. And that's kind of evolved to now where I'm writing these poems for children, lessons in letting go, but it's all through nature, and all this humor is ending up coming out through it, like birds that are afraid of heights, and a woodpecker that gets headaches from pecking trees and has to go find a cure because I needed him out of the
I like
way for
that.
this family of squirrels to move into where he pecked the trees. And I'm having a blast. It's really
Yeah,
fun. And
there you
Thursday
go.
nights I have a poetry critique group, and they're loving it. I was really blown away. And like, where are you coming up with these names? Because Swinster Sam and Flotsam Fred and just all these different names. It's just really fun to write. I'm having a great time with it. And at some point, I'll be looking for some little kids to be baited to
Well, I
read
mean,
to them to get
that's
feedback.
the whole purpose. I mean, you stumble upon what you like, and what you like
Yeah.
usually turns out to be what the reader likes. Um, and I
And
love that.
one of my first big interview was with Henry Winkler and Lynn Oliver. And I had always had this burning desire to interview Henry Winkler because I remember him doing Happy Days and then being typecast and wanting to know what he did, which was finally writing these children's books. He's severely dyslexic,
Mhm.
and talking to them about it. What they liked about my interview was that I asked them a lot of questions that they never had before. It was a very different interview. And that again came from my burning desire to know what happened with him, how he was able to stay getting work. What did he do until finally he got to do other roles besides, nobody wanted to touch him because of his role as Fonzie in Happy Days for years and years and years. That was my main motivation for that. Like I wanted to know what happened. How did you cope with that? What was the outcome? And then when they talked about that they don't believe in writer's block. And when I said why, I said because if you have writer's block, you're not writing the thing you need to be writing. Because
No,
when you
I agree
find
with
your
that. Yeah,
niche, it becomes easier.
yeah.
Mike, what are
So
your
what do you
thoughts
think
on
about
writer's
that?
block?
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that I got it when I first started, and a form of it is overwriting and never pulling the trigger and getting it out there. Yeah, there's nothing that approaches or will ever approach perfection. It either works or it doesn't, and at a certain point, you have to get it out. If
Mhm.
something isn't working, then you really should move on or take another tack, approach it from a different angle. Maybe it would work as something else, from a different point of view, first person versus third person or what have you. If it's not working at all, you really need to move on. And sometimes these
Mhm.
ideas, when you come back to them fresh, have a way of working out in your mind when they didn't originally. But you can't be too hard on yourself. If something is too difficult, there may be a reason for it. Maybe it's just
Hmm.
not for you or for the reader. But the most important thing is just to keep moving. Never remain stagnant.
And do you ever get like an idea for something and then you write it down, set it aside, and maybe nothing happens for years, then all of a sudden you get the connection? Because years
Yeah, I
ago
mean,
I had
it's happening
experience like,
this week
hmm
where I had these ideas, and going back to the 16-year-old daughter, dad jokes, but in a way where it's just a sadness about the father, in his lot in life. And I just never could figure it out. But it just seems at a certain point that it's ready, and it's like ready to give
hmm
birth. And it just comes out easily. If
hmm
something is torturous to write, it's probably not going to be so fun to read.
I agree. That's been my experience.
Any other
Yes,
questions for Mike? I'm sorry, Ton, I didn't mean to interrupt.
you're
Any
fine.
other questions?
This has just been great.
That's been, this has been wonderful. Okay, I don't see anything or hear anything, so I'm going to assume that there's no more questions for Mike.
How
Mike,
do we
thank
how
you
do we
so.
contact Mike?
Oh, I was just about to say,
Oh,
I think it's very important as a writer to have your contact information easily obtainable because a lot of editors will see someone's writing, Google them, there's no way to find their work. I'm on mikesacks.com, and through my
Hmm.
website, you can find how to contact me.
Hmm.
Um, and I encourage anyone to do so. I like receiving emails.
Mike, this
I'll
has been.
imitate. I'll say I'm Don Vaughn and ask for advice.
I won't give it to you.
Mike, thank you so very much for joining us this evening.
I
This is
love
just,
this
it's
group,
been
guys.
great
Thank you.
fun. We've got a great group. I'm so proud of this organization, and we're able to bring in cool speakers like you. This is really educational and really insightful, and we appreciate it very, very much. I
Well,
hope
of
that we didn't
course.
take you away from something more important.
No, not at all. And just keep at it, guys. I think you're doing the right thing. I wish I was down there in Carolina with you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
We
Thank
appreciate
you
that,
so
Mike,
much.
very much.